Hello and good morning to all of you extraordinary human beings out there. I'm maintaining positivity going into this week as we are fast approaching the first month of spring. I can't speak for anyone but myself, but dang nabbit did this winter fly by. And plus I need something to distract me from the fact that my week of cat sitting is coming to an end. I had the most amazing time with Bubs. Almost instantly, after I showed him the windows of course, he found a spot right at the edge of my bed, kind of where I record and write, and stuck by me all week long. Besides the wettest cat poo of all time that made me nauseous this morning, he was an angel. Whether or not my itch for a pet has been scratched is still up for debate. Welp, shall we get into it? Today, I bring you the Executioner Special. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from a whole slew of different places, but mainly history.uk, and I will put the rest down below. As I covered in many of my recent episodes, plenty of criminals convicted of crime in Britain throughout history have faced the death penalty, which comes in many forms, most notably death by hanging. However, this method wasn't frequented or really that effective until much later in history, and we'll get into that in a bit. Some consider the British as the ones to popularize this tact, as they had performed it for centuries. Even as early as the Anglo-Saxon era, aka the Dark Ages, up until 1965 when capital punishment was abolished, Britain really made a name for itself in the world of executions. But it didn't start there. White people actually didn't invent everything. According to PBS, as far back as the ancient laws of China, the death penalty has been established as a punishment for crime. In 18th century BC, the Code of King Hammurabi codified the death penalty for 25 different crimes, although murder was not among them. The first death sentence historically recorded was in the 16th century BC Egypt, where the wrongdoer, a member of nobility, was accused of magic and ordered to take his own life. The 7th century BC Draconian Code of Athens made death the penalty for every single crime committed. And in the 5th century BC, the Roman law of the 12 Tablets codified the death penalty. And again, throughout all these periods, the death penalty was different for nobility, freemen, and slaves, and even the level of punishment for crimes varied as such. But just to name a few of the odd crimes resulting in the death penalty, we have the publication of libel, insulting songs, the cutting or grazing of crops, the burning of a house, or the burning of a stack of corn near a house, perjury, that makes sense, or making disturbances at night in the city. Death was often cruel and included crucifixion, drowning at sea, burials alive, beating to death, and impalement, which was often used by Nero. The Romans had a curious punishment for parricides, which is a murder of a parent. The condemned was put in a sack which also contained a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a gorilla, and then they submerged this sack in water. The most notorious death execution in BC was about the year 399, when the Greek philosopher Socrates was required to drink poison for heresy and the corruption of youth. And now we are on the flip side. By the 10th century, hanging from the gallows was the most frequent execution method. Although some people during this time frame, such as William the Conqueror, opposed taking life except in war and ordered no person to be hanged or executed for any offense. But he did allow criminals to be mutilated for their crimes. During the Middle Ages, capital punishment was accompanied by torture. Most barons had a drowning pit as well as gallows, and they were used for major and minor crimes. Boiling to death was another penalty approved in 1531, and there are records to show some people boiled for up to 2 hours before death took them. When a woman was burned, the executioner tied a rope around her neck when she was tied to the stake. When the flames reached her, she could be strangled from outside of the ring of fire. However, this often failed, and many women were literally burnt alive. The article goes on to describe the history of capital punishment in America and later the downfall or abolishment, but that is a whole other monster. The most interesting part to me is that over centuries of hanging people at the gallows, they didn't figure out it was much easier to snap their necks with the fall rather than watch them asphyxiate until about the 19th century. But I think it's more likely that they just enjoyed the suffering. During that same era, the Victorian era, Britain introduced what is known as the Bloody Code, a time when nearly 270 crimes were punishable by death. A time when scores of people in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes reaching 300,000 people, that would attend public executions in joy and celebration. 270 crimes is a lot, but it's not as many as all of the crimes. That's insane. Would you go to a public execution? Theoretically. There's no public shame, no chance of being canceled, no phones. Would you go? I think I would. Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray wrote about how gross these public executions felt after attending them. I'm just saying, they went for a reason. The first executioner I want to bring you all today is Jan Midlar, aka the Master Executioner of Prague, aka the Prague Punisher. Born into a wealthy family in the Bohemian town of Krudym during the 17th century, Midlar was destined for greatness. He became a top medical student in his field, and he had sought to save lives and bring about positive change. But then he fell in love with his cousin, and when she was accused of murder and sentenced to death, Jan, blinded by love, was determined to save her. He left his medical studies and, I guess, applied to become an executioner in order to get closer to her. He succeeded in becoming an executioner, but before he could do anything, she was hung in front of him while Jan was forced to watch. Now that is a villain origin story. And so he fully embraced his newfound profession with a heart full of sorrow. Famously, he was known to wear a red hood rather than a black one while performing these executions. Quote, Jan Midlar's most infamous act was the execution of 27 ringleaders in Prague. A pivotal event in Czech history. Among those executed was his own best friend, a heartbreaking reminder of the sacrifices Midlar was forced to make in the name of duty. On June 22, 1621, the people of Prague gathered in its famous Old Town Square to witness a grim spectacle, the execution of 27 Bohemian rebel leaders. Some were strung up, while others were decapitated with the sword. One unfortunate chap had his tongue cut off prior to beheading, while others had their hands lopped off before their heads. The man who led the execution on this terrible day was Jan Midlar, known as the Master Executioner of Prague. The worst part to me is being like one of the last few people after you watch 23 people get freaking killed in front of you and then you just have to wait your turn. Jan's unwavering loyalty to the crown, even in the face of personal turmoil, killing his friend, ultimately led to his downfall. Following the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, he was forced to flee Prague, leaving behind a life he once knew. Banished, he succumbed to poverty and his family forever exiled from their beloved city. End quote. On to the next one. Franz Schmidt executed his first man at the age of 18, following in his father's footsteps. On that day in the year 1573, quote, Franz Schmidt, heretofore only an apprentice to his father's craft, conducted his first solo hanging. As the body of the thief hung there, his father, an established thief executioner, stepped forward and ritually slapped the teenage hangman 3 times, announcing his successful passage into the ranks of Germany's Master Executioners, end quote. And from that day on, Franz Schmidt legally killed 361 people and tortured many more for much lesser crimes. According to Executed Today, executioners occupied this strange, outcast social niche, in charge of not only death sentences but of other dishonorable public tasks. Either as a cause or a consequence of this, the profession carried its own stigma for underworldly, less than respectable behavior, and it was not unheard of for a shady executioner to wind up climbing the scaffold as a patient rather than a hangman. But in his 45-year career, Franz operated with ahead of his time dignity and sobriety, so much so that Schmidt was granted citizenship in Nuremberg and eventually had his civic honor officially restored. He freed himself and his heirs from the social pollution of his life's work, which is not an ending that most executioners are lucky enough to behold. The craziest part about Franz Schmidt, he kept a detailed diary of every time he killed or punished somebody. In addition to the 361 people he executed, another 345 were beaten, tortured, or had their appendages removed. According to Wikipedia, the individual entries contain dates, places, methods of execution, names, origins, and later in life, even details of the crimes on which the sentence was based. Franz executed criminals by rope, sword, the breaking wheel, burning, and drowning. The wheel was reserved for severely violent criminals, burnings for the homosexuals, quote, and counterfeiting money, which only occurred twice in his whole career. Drowning was commuted regularly in the Nuremberg of Schmidt's time until death by sword was popularized. The breaking wheel torture method I mentioned was new to me. I had to look that one up. Basically, the criminal is tied to a large wooden wagon wheel, where then the executioner takes a hammer and begins striking the condemned over and over, typically starting at the ankles, like Kathy Bates in Misery, if that helps paint you an image. Their main goal is to turn your bones into jelly, starting from your feet up until everywhere else. After they receive their designated amount of blows, they are retied to this wheel like a bag of loose bones playing Twister and left outside to starve or wither away, normally within hours of this brutal beating. There was one man who is said to have survived 9 days on the wheel after every single bone in his body was broken. This leads us to our next executioner, my personal favorite, John or Jack Ketch, aka the Hatchet Man. According to Dirty Sexy History, Jack Ketch had a reputation for brutality and incompetence. But the truth might be much more complicated than that. Although executions were highly ritualized, there was nothing in place that we might think of as a quality control, and bribery was a more than frequent occurrence. It was the norm. Apart from his wages and the money he made from selling off pieces of the deceased, like their clothing, Ketch would have received a great deal of money in bribes. If the condemned had the coin, they would attempt to bribe the executioner for a swift and merciful death. The condemned were not the only people bribing executioners. Following the horribly botched execution of Lord William Russell in 1683 and the Duke of Monmouth in 1685, rumors ran rampant that although both men paid Ketch to be merciful, their enemies paid him more to make them suffer. He denied the rumors, as anyone would, but one has to wonder how a man who made his living executing people for 23 years could fail at his task so spectacularly. He wasn't an amateur. And yet during the execution of this poor Monmouth, Ketch struck him 5 times with an axe, and would have to end up taking his head with a knife. This had been so horrific that Ketch had to make his escape under the protection of a military guard to avoid being beaten by the crowd. For every botched execution Ketch presided over, there were several that went off without a hitch. In the same case, if a person were lucky enough to survive their execution, they were typically allowed to carry on living, as that was very, very rare. In 1709, years after Ketch's death, John Smith was hanged at Tyburn and left there for some time before he was cut down and revived. He made a full recovery and was allowed to live out his life from that day on, being known as the, quote, half-hanged Smith. Okay, back to the selling of a dead person's clothing. That was a massive market. Grisly as it sounds, quote, execution paraphernalia was widely believed to carry serious magic and was in high demand. Even so much as a strand of the hangman's rope was believed to cure any number of ailments when it was worn around the neck, and gamblers sought pieces to improve their luck. Nooses had been used to cure headaches by wrapping them around the temples. The efficacy of these cures was not in question, and the public was willing to pay for whatever they could get their hands on. Which kind of seems cool at first glance, that's what I thought, but it's honestly a nasty industry that still thrives today, and I will get more into that later on. But last but not least, our final executioner. The woman from hell. My sister. I'm just teasing. According to history.uk, one dark and stormy night in November of 1789, a tall, black-bearded man came to stay at the lodging house of one Elizabeth Sugru in Roscommon, Ireland. The guest was finely dressed and paid Elizabeth in gold pieces. Jealous of her houseguest's apparent wealth, she crept into his room while he slept that night, stabbed him to death, and robbed him of his gold. The mysterious stranger turned out to be her long-lost son, Padraig. How she never realized it was her son before killing him, I don't know. But she was sentenced to death and taken to Roscommon Gaol. In front of the assembled crowd and in chains, she waited to be strung up. As they waited, the hangman never showed. Turns out he was sick that day, and Elizabeth volunteered to take his place. According to legend, she bellowed to the sheriffs, "Set me free and I'll hang them all." She duly hanged the prisoners right then and there, calmly and coolly. Dubbed the woman from hell, she lived for the rest of her life as a live-in hangwoman at the prison. Some say she was even paid and would happily and with gusto flog criminals in the prison and even out on the street. The number of victims on her rope is said to have numbered in the hundreds. The legend of Elizabeth lingered on for generations in the public's imagination of Ireland. As her story goes, she was then murdered by another prisoner in 1807. And that is all I have for you today in the way of executioners. I hope you found some of it interesting. I know I had a blast diving into it all. Thank you once again for listening and taking the time out of your day. As always, stick around for a bit extra after the music, and I will see you guys later. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Hello, hello! Do you remember when that submarine went missing? And then, did they ever find them? I wrote, I wonder what happened with that, but I think they found them, right? As I mentioned above, I want to explore the dark world of murderabilia, which sounds like an STI. Titled, Hobby or Horror, the eerie and dark practice of collecting memorabilia connected to murderers, written by the staff at Inside Edition. In the eerie world of murderabilia, people buy, sell, and barter the belongings, creations, and even body parts of murderers and serial killers. Everything from the locks of Manson's hair to clown paintings done by serial killer John Wayne Gacy is available for a price in a market that parallels the country's ever-growing fascination with true crime. Gacy, who murdered, raped, and tortured at least 33 boys, mostly in his small Illinois community, had originally sold his works for small amounts of money, reportedly just enough for him to buy fresh art supplies. Currently, they list on auction sites for upwards of $12,000. The marketplace for such commerce is called murderabilia, a name coined by Andy Kahn, the director of victim services and advocacy for Crime Stoppers of Houston. He travels the nation carrying bags filled with clothes, artwork, and fingernail clippings once owned by these killers. At public events, he uses them as props to drive home the point that selling and buying such items is reprehensible and should be illegal. Is reprehensible and should be illegal. Also, I apologize if you hear a bell in the background. That's just Kitty. This constitutes blood money, and you shouldn't be able to rob, rape, and murder, then turn around and make a buck off that, Khan told Inside Edition. For families of the murdered, the transactions can ravage and rip open barely healed wounds. I was completely outraged, Mark Kloss, the father of Polly Kloss, told Inside Edition. Polly, who was infamously kidnapped in 1993 at the age of 12 and killed by serial killer Richard Allen Davis. Okay, I know I said that the kitty was walking around. Now the kitty's in my lap. Meow. Say hi, kitty. Meow. No. Alrighty, so forgive me, I lost my spot. Anywho's, Polly was kidnapped and killed by Richard Allen Davis. Mark Kloss learned from Andy Kahn that photos of Davis in the prison yard at San Quentin were being sold on the internet, as well as the drawings he had penned on death row. I went through the roof. I was so angry. I was so bitter. I was so enraged by the entire proposition that this could even go on. It's almost hard to describe. I mean, it's just filthy and sordid, he continued. Collecting stuff like that, purchasing it, trading it, selling it, having anything to do with it makes me want to go and take a shower right now. The collectors, who readily acknowledge they're bewitched by the dark and macabre, describe their acquisitions as hobbies. I just enjoy collecting. It's not cerebral, said 38-year-old Ryan Graveface, a musician and owner of the indie label Graveface Records. I'm not thinking of it in like a profound way, although I'm sure there are a lot of pretentious people that would. We're all just weirdo collectors. The music entrepreneur says he doesn't buy or sell much anymore, but rather barters and trades for items. I'm like a curator hoarder, he said. Whether it's viewed as horrid or hoarding, regulating the sale or trading of murderabilia has proven harder than most would envision. A handful of states address the issue, but most don't. Recent federal legislation efforts have died in committees. The Son of Sam law, hastily enacted in 1977 after serial killer David Berkowitz exclusively sold his story rights, prevented criminals from profiting off their crimes through the sales of books, movies, TV shows, and magazines. It mandated that any profits from such works could be seized and made available to victims, bye-bye, bub, and their families. But that was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1991 after Simon & Schuster sued, saying the law infringed upon the constitutional guarantee of free speech. The publishing giant filed its lawsuit over the recollections of mob informant Henry Hill, which became the basis of Wise Guys, which turned into the hit movie Goodfellas. Directed by Martin Scorsese, 1995. Andy Kahn said he had tried several times in the past 12 years to get a federal bill through, but he's never been successful. William Harder owns MurderAuction.com, an online auction house specializing in murder memorabilia. His Fresno, California business is one of the better-known websites in the world of crime collectors. A Gacy clown painting, reportedly done in the last days of his life, is up for auction with bids beginning at $12,000. An autographed string of artwork by Manson is currently listed at $65,000. For those on tighter budgets, 2 business cards from Jack Kevorkian, the Doctor of Death, can be had for $7 a pop. Harder also manufactures serial killer bobblehead dolls. His top sellers are likenesses of Adolf Hitler and Ted Bundy. I had a guy buy 10 Hitler dolls as a gift for his family, he recounted. Given the political climate nowadays, it's okay to be racist again. Which is insane to say in an interview. How do you... Whatever. He sees no harm in what he does and says collecting is nothing more than a pastime. I want to be clear, that is not the article in its entirety. I urge you to read the rest of it at Inside Edition. I kind of tried my best to highlight both sides of the argument, although I'm sure you can tell which way I'm leaning. And that'll about do it today, folks. Again, I'm sorry if my mic or sound at the end kind of got all messed up with Kitty, but that's okay. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. A bit different formatting, just trying it out. Thank you again, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.